If you want to execute code repeatedly, while loops are a tool that you can use. They consist of 3 parts: the while keyword, a condition, and a code block that will be executed until the condition is not true. So, for example, we can initialize an integer variable counter to 0 before the while loop and execute the while loop as long as the counter is less than 10. Then, inside the while loop, we first print the value of the counter variable and then increase its value by 1. After the while loop, we also add an additional log statement that indicates that we have finished the while loop. So, what happens now if we execute the program? First, we initialize the variable to 0 and then check the condition of the while loop. Since our variable is currently 0, the condition is true and we will enter the code block of the while loop. Then, for each iteration of the loop, we go from top to bottom of what is inside of the code block of the while loop. So first, we print the value and then we increase its value by 1. When we reach the end of the code block of the while segment, we jump back up to the condition and validate if it still is true. Currently, our variable is 1 and therefore we will enter the code block again because the condition is still true. Fast forward until the value of our variable is 10. Now we check the condition and see that it is not true anymore. Therefore, we don't enter the code block of the while loop anymore and continue with the code that comes after the while block. In our case, the log statement finished while loop. This is the output in the console. It confirms that we print the values from 0 to 9 and then the statement that indicates that the while loop has finished. One thing you can also use to stop a loop from inside a loop is the break keyword. This keyword tells the program to jump out of or abandon the loop in which it is written, and then continue with the code that follows the while loop. If we add it to our example that we had before and take a look at the log, we can see that we print the value of our variable only once. This happens because after the log statement we say break, which tells the program to jump out of this loop. What you also can do is to nest while loops inside of each other. For example, like this. So now we have a counter outside and a counter inside variable. The counter inside variable gets initialized at the first statement inside our outside while loop. Then we print the values of the variables inside the second while loop. After that we increase counter inside at the end of the inner while loop and counter outside at the end of the outer while loop. So what do you think will happen when we execute this program now? Basically what will happen is that we will execute the outside while loop 10 times like before. However, during each iteration we execute the inside while loop 10 times. Let's run a brief example execution. First we enter the outside while loop and initialize counter inside. Then we check the condition for the inside while loop. Since our variable is still 0, the condition is true and we will enter the inside while loop. Next, we log the values of the variables and increase the value of counter inside. What happens now is that we jump to the condition of the inner while loop again and check if it is still true. This process continues as long as the condition for the inner while loop is true. If we reach a state where the condition is false, for example, when counter inside has the value of 10, we continue with the code that comes after this inner while loop. On the screen you can see a snippet of what will be printed in the log, showing that for every time we increase the counter outside variable, we have 10 log statements that come from the inside while loop. One additional disclaimer. Let's assume you use a break statement inside the inner while loop. Then you will only break out of the inner while loop, but you will still continue with the execution of the outer while loop. Lastly, I want to briefly put extra focus on defining the condition of your loops. One thing you should make sure of is that the condition will become false at a certain point in time. If your condition stays true forever and you also don't use break to jump out of your while loop, then you have a so-called infinite loop, since it will never terminate. Infinite loops can cause your game to freeze up, since it will always try to execute the while loop indefinitely. Therefore, it is always good to double check the condition you use for your loops. Your first task is to find all prime numbers between 1 and 100. Obviously, you should use while loops to achieve this. If you find a prime number, just log its value to the output log. The second task might be a bit more tricky. Namely, use a while loop to reverse a custom f string. And after the while loop, print the original string and the reversed version. Like always, if you have any problems, let me know in the comments. Otherwise, see you next time.